I'm John Lawrence. I worked on Capitol Hill for 38 years. The last 8, I was the Chief of Staff for the Democratic Speaker and House Leader Nancy Pelosi. Prior to that, I worked for Congressman George Miller of California, both as his Chief of Staff and then as the Staff Director for 2 committees that he led. The Committee on Natural Resources and the Committee on Education and Labor. I graduated from Oberlin College with a degree in history. Did a thesis there on urbanization of Lorain, Ohio, and then went to graduate school at Berkeley and received a PhD there. Did my dissertation on the growth of class consciousness in the labor movement in San Francisco. Dealing with the factions and the personal agendas and the personalities of members of Congress is something that most people won't experience, and most even close observers don't understand, and you have that perspective. Being a historian, I think, and it served me well in Congress, is part about being a skeptic and not believing that things are the way they were. And you've got to know where to draw the lines. You don't want to be crotchety and just a negative. But the essence of history, it seems to me, and I try to do this in my professional work, and I try to pass it along to people I talk to, is don't believe what people tell you necessarily. Dig down to the next level. Ask the next question. And try to evaluate things not based on try to evaluate data not based on the position of the person you're talking, or the officialness of what it is, but use your training, and that's what training is, to balance it and to try to figure out what really happened, or in the case of legislation, what's really important here. And that's a lot different than, do you have the facts to prove it? If you don't have the facts to prove it, then it doesn't matter, which is sort of what the lawyers come with. Well, as historians, we know it's not always that easy. It's not always yes, no, true, false. There's a lot of gray. And law and statutes don't do well with gray. They need to know yes, no, this is allowed, this isn't allowed. And so at some point you got to make that pivot, particularly if you're dealing with things like criminal statutes or regulatory activity. But there's a little bit of a mismatch there, because things aren't quite as distinct as people would like them to be, and that's what part of what that training is really helpful. Having the kind of proximity that I had to the speaker, for example, and a very consequential speaker and a very domineering speaker in the sense of having real control over the process and driving the process. One of the things that did for me was to, I don't know if I can explain this correctly, but it sort of humanized a lot of the people of the past, and realized, not that I didn't intuitively know it, but a lot of these great people of the past were pretty much people like us, sort of sitting around a room trying to figure out, how the hell do I get out of this mess, or I got to get around this one senator, I got to get around this faction in our caucus. What am I going to do? What are we going to do? How can we put this together? And I also appreciate people more as politicians and less as icons. I've gotten to know the last 2 presidents pretty well personally, and I look at them as what it's like when I'm sitting and talking to them privately, and what it's like when they're out, when the cameras are on. And it's just an interesting observation that may or may not have any real implications with respect to specific legislation or a specific legislative decision, but it does color my view of them and of people who are in these positions making decisions.